Good morning. My name's Caroline Harding. I work for Defence Digital, which is the digital and IT organisation for the Ministry of Defence. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent work that we've done in terms of creating a policy for a complex SIAM ecosystem. So the piece of work that I'm going to talk about is sort of roughly about 2 years of work over the last couple of years, and it's still ongoing because, as with anything, it's going to be a continual improvement activity. But I'm going to share some of the work that we did and some of the approaches that we took in order to kind of create that complex policy for this SIAM ecosystem. And you might have seen in the news this week that there's obviously been a strategic defence review that's been happening. So there's been some changes already to some of the information that I'm going to share with you. But Defence Digital, like I said, is the digital and IT organisation for the Ministry of Defence. There's some figures on the screen that kind of puts into a little bit of context the sort of scale and size of the operation that we're talking about. And I should also mention that whilst Defence Digital produce and procure services or IT and digital services for the Ministry of Defence, there are a number of other digital services and operations throughout the Ministry of Defence that are kind of done outside of Defence Digital, which makes our SIAM ecosystem slightly more complex. I'm the assistant head of IT policy and design for a part of the organisation called Operational Service Management, and we are part of the live service integration capability for the MoD. And on the screen, I'm sharing some statistics just to kind of put into context what we were dealing with, the size and scale of and the difficulty of some of the challenges that we face on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And about 2 years ago, there was a decision taken from above that we needed something more innovative. We needed a new approach to the way that our services were being allowed to enter our digital enterprise, how they would be permitted to join the network, essentially. And like I say, the work I'm talking about is not necessarily something new in as much that it was a sort of an up gun of a policy that existed already. And the piece of work that I'm talking about is specifically for operations, and my particular focus was service management. Um, so the decision was taken that we needed something new, we needed something to do something different, and how we're going to address that particular issue. Um, and as you would imagine, with something like the defence, we're not particularly, well, we're a very risk averse organisation. So it's a constant balancing act between compliance, ensuring services meet the minimum compliance for regulations and for security and for service management and a whole host of other sort of rules and regulations, between compliance and agility, so the speed in which we need to be able to deliver services to our end users and our consumers. And so that was the sort of backdrop to which I found myself in a few years ago, as to how are we going to address that? How are we going to take that forward? And so I set about sort of talking to a number of different stakeholders, adopting ITIL 4 principles. Start where you are. What have we got already? And so we were looking at these two routes that we had. So we had a policy that existed that defined the rules that people needed to adopt in order to be permitted to join our network. So all services had to follow those particular rules in order to be able to be given the authority to operate within our digital enterprise. And then there were additional rules that were asked of services if they were joining our SIAM ecosystem. So the SIAM ecosystem didn't necessarily stretch to the whole organization. There were certain services that were expected to integrate, and there were others that didn't have to because of the complexity of the organization. For example, when we're talking about our organization, we're talking different sort of classifications of information. So we have services that operate within official. So all the information I'm sharing with you today is what's classed as official, is available openly. We have even different gradings with official. We have official sensitive, which has to be treated in a slightly different way. We have secret services, which obviously, as you would expect, have to be treated with a greater degree of security, and top secret or above secret services, which, as you can imagine, obviously have the tightest sort of restrictions restrictions was on them. We also have different domains. So we have services that operate within the fixed base. So, you know, I work in an office, and so those fixed services are provided in a particular way. But we also have deployed services. And when we talk about deployed, we don't mean deployed in IT sense. We're talking about services that are delivered to ships and sort of individuals in a sort of a theatre, a war theatre, and they obviously operate in very different ways. So we have to cater for all of those different classifications and different domains. So the rules in the old policy were to focus on all those different areas. And then we had some additional controls and rules for services that were integrating with our ecosystem. So those two parallel activities had very different messages, and they followed that parallel path and didn't meet. But what we were proposing was that actually we would have one message, or one forum, if you like, that would allow all services and our integrated services to follow one path. So rather than having different messages or different documents for them to be able to adhere to that information, we would repurpose our service management framework, which already existed, in order to talk about the level of integration and the compliance that they needed to do in for this particular policy. We've been operating a SIAM ecosystem for a number of years, but this current instantiation is around 4 years old. And so the service management framework has typically defined that level of integration with our SIAM ecosystem. And that's what we were proposing that we would do here. But we would look at the sort of minimum levels of integration in order to get the most value from our services across the entire organization, whether they were fully integrated or not. And so I set about talking to our leaders to kind of get some key messages about what they wanted from this future direction and how this was going to work. And the sort of messages I got from them were things like, we want something innovative. We don't want to do what we've always done. We need something different. We want something dynamic. We don't want something that's static, that takes a long time to update. We need to be able to move quickly to address the technological advances. We need to be able to, even for what's happened this week with the Strategic Defence Review, we need to respond to that change in terms of our organisational structure. For instance, thinking about our NATO services, so our federatable services, as well as all those different uh, structures and difficulties I talked about earlier with the different domains. We need to be able to respond to the threat and the need that we have at any particular given moment. We want something more easily consumable. So we don't want something that is very difficult to navigate. We want something that is going to make it easy for people to follow, easy for people to comply. And that's the other difficulty that we have within our organization, is that we've got very different cultures. We have the civil servant culture, where obviously those people are there generally for a longer period of time. We have military services, so military personnel who work in our organisation and across obviously the MoD, and typically they're in post for maybe 2 or 3 years. So there's a constant change, constant flux of people going in and out of the organization, taking that knowledge with them. So that knowledge transfer is always very difficult. We also have a number of contractors and industry partners that work with us, who again are obviously very sort of transitional, because they're coming in and that on off contract. So we needed to make sure that the information that we're providing was to the right people at the right time and was easy to follow. It's also important to kind of refer to the fact that some of the people that we're dealing with are not necessarily SIAM or ITIL experts. Um, Obviously, most of our industry partners and our contractors and our service providers would be, but some of the people that are designing and delivering the services within the organisation, military personnel, for example, this may be sort of an additional job that they have. So we had to make sure that the information that we were giving enabled them to access it and understand what was being asked of them. It also needs to be proportionate, and that's one of the things that I really want to kind of get across today, is that this new way of doing things was looking at a proportionate level of compliance to policy. The controls and the standards that we were asking was proportionate, depending on the size and scale of the service, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And when I said to my senior leadership team, so have you got any examples of what you want it to look like? Have you got anything that you've seen already that is good that we could use as a baseline? And they said, no, this will be the exemplar. So no pressure there. So at that point, I set about trying to understand, okay, what have we got already? What the existing policy, what do people like about it? What do they want to keep? What do they want to change? Where can we go with this? And I said about having interviews with a whole variety of stakeholders, from service owners, delivery teams, rule owners, so the existing rule owners, people that were sort of evaluating the evidence against compliance, case officers, so people that help services navigate through the journey of compliance with policy, assurance board members, so the people that actually rubber stamp to say, yep, absolutely, you've got the authority to integrate or to go live onto our digital enterprise, and service providers. So what's it like for someone joining the MoD ecosystem? What were they saying to us? So the messages that really came through is that to be given details of the controls, the expectations at the earliest point in their delivery of their services was key, in order to move that information even earlier than they were getting, or at that particular time anyway, so that they could build those controls, they could build that compliance into the delivery of their service and the design of their service, to make sure that it was something that was just done as part of that delivery of service, rather than sort of something seen as an additional on top extra. They wanted a clear, concise message. They wanted to make sure that they understood it was easy to understand, but it was clear that they didn't want us to sacrifice clarity for brevity. So if something's complex, explain it, give the guidance, help that with that message. Don't kind of say something in one sentence when actually you do need to use multiple sentences. They wanted a clear, concise message, um, but they wanted that explanation. Clear, easy to follow process, so a navigable process, tools and automation to help, and that kind of aligned with our sort of direction for looking at innovation, and the guidance and support available. This is quite key actually, because we wanted to move from a sort of a very personnel heavy guidance and support, so that when somebody didn't understand something, they had to contact them via email or on Teams, and it was a sort of an onerous task on both individuals, or multiple teams in many cases, to a sort of self-help model. So what could we put in place that would help people understand how to do this, and give them the information at the point they needed it, without necessarily involving other teams? How could we, all this information is available, how could we make it easier for people to find that and get it when they needed it? So then we took about talking to our senior leadership and say, okay, we've got this opportunity. We're doing something different. What do we want to do? What do we want to achieve with this cut of the policy? How can we fix some of the issues that we've been experiencing over the recent weeks and months? And it was a very clear message from them that we wanted to uplift the minimum levels of integration. So we already had a number of services that were integrated with our SIAM ecosystem. Um, but but the ones that didn't, typically for a number of reasons, because of classification of the service or where they sat in the organization, we needed to incorporate them at a minimum level, so that we could really benefit from our experience and our tools and our teams and our knowledge of service management. So as a base level, we had to improve the maturity of our CMDB, so the quality of the configuration items and the granularity of detail that we had in our CMDB. That was one of the requests from our senior leadership team, that we wanted to have a minimum level of integration via our service desk. So typically, our service desk supplies a number of services. It doesn't supply services in a deployed environment at the moment. As you can imagine, if you're on a ship in the middle of the ocean, it's unlikely that you're going to be calling our service desk to help with a particular issue. But we still want visibility of those systems and services, so that if tickets do end up erroneously there, that we can point them in the right direction, and there's a minimum visibility of all those services via the service desk, so that we can improve our end user experience across the organization. forward schedule of change. So we wanted to have kind of a better, maturer forward schedule of change from all services, not just those that are integrated with us. So even those ones that don't typically integrate with us are woven into that forward schedule of change. And problem management, that all suppliers and services would consult on problem management activity, even when they weren't necessarily the sort of the kind of lead service provider, if you like, where potentially there may well be a supporting problem, or there might be a supporting dependency that they would all kind of lead in to support that problem management activity. So this is sort of a kind of high level sort of description of our SIAM ecosystem. And in the middle there, you can see the service management architecture and framework. So this is the Defence Digital SIAM ecosystem. And there's a number of services that sit outside Defence Digital. We talk about top level budget holders or frontline commands, so things like the Army Command, Land Command, Air Command, Naval Command. We talk about those different commands, and a number of those different commands have their own services that they procure and run and deliver outside of Defence Digital that don't touch our SIAM ecosystem. They may use our underlying infrastructure, but they weren't typically integrated. And for the first time, what we were proposing was that our service management framework would actually wrap around those services and ensure that there was that minimum level of integration. So this is quite a big change for us, because it meant that typically we're onboarding services even at a very minimum level to our ecosystem, so that we have that greater visibility of those services. So we looked at the sort of the model and how we were going to do this, and how we were going to kind of give the information, because we weren't saying that a one size fits all approach fitted. We weren't saying that everyone had to do the same level of or the same standard, for instance, for service management, or the same level of controls. So we were trying to keep as much as possible the same. So as you can see from this diagram that we put together, the service inception and the service design and build, for whether they were a service that typically integrated or didn't, would follow the similar pattern. And we would push the information, we would push the controls that they needed to follow at that very early stage. So if you can see on the box on the far left, the OSM front door, we were suggesting, that's operational service management front door, we were suggesting that even at that service inception stage, we need to have conversations with those services coming through, so that we could give them the triage of what their service would look like, and give them the relevant controls to achieve the required standard before they start that service design and build activity. And then at that point, once the service design on the service design exit had happened, then the registered services, which what we were calling services that didn't typically integrate with us, would follow one route into service transition, and they would follow the compliance for policy. As opposed to the OSM integrator services, so the operational service management integrator services within our SIAM ecosystem, they would follow a different route and have some additional checks that they needed to do to be able to integrate with our tool sets and our processes and practices and so forth. And when we were writing the policy, we wanted to make sure that we were pitching the information at the right level. So we use this taxonomy, and like I said earlier, that this particular piece of work was part of a larger piece of work. So whilst I was writing a policy for operations and specifically service management, there were a number of other elements to this policy that included data, cybersecurity, architecture, for example, and they were following the similar taxonomy. One of the things that we found was some of the wording in the original taxonomy didn't quite work for us. So we set about kind of tweaking it and sort of sharing that with our wider community to see whether this worked for them. And actually, in the end, this was the taxonomy that was adopted. So at the top level, you can see the principle and policy of what the policy is trying to achieve. And we found it helpful to add this additional column of taxonomy and practice, so that the information that was being pitched could be given to the right stakeholders. So at the very top, the principles and policy is likely to be given to very senior leaders who are on the hook for the services themselves, don't need to know the detail behind it, but need to understand what their funding, what their service is delivering, what their accountabilities are. And so the principles and the policy statements and the rationale for those became really important to make sure that that was clearly communicated and understood. And then if you look to the next two layers of standards and controls, this is very important for assurance purposes, because these were the things that were being measured when services were going through various gated processes for compliance. These were the measures that they were going to be adhering to. So that was the next level of granularity. And when I talk about the service management framework, that's essentially now a standard, and the number of controls that sit underneath it are what the services are measured against, both at those gated opportunities and through life. And then there's a whole raft of explanatory information, procedures, and guidance that enables that next level of detail down for those architects or service designers or individuals that need to understand how it works. So here, this just gives you a little bit of information about the levels of integration that we were proposing. So we already had this concept of supplier tiering in the sort of previous instantiation of this. We had supplier tierings, and tier one, as you perhaps would imagine, was the sort of biggest level of that tier. So services that had the closest integration with our ecosystem, they adhered to more of our processes and practices, or all of them. They closely coupled with our tooling and tool sets. And they, generally speaking, had the sort of the most likely to cause impact to our digital enterprise. So tier ones were those kind of big services. Tier twos potentially where they might have been still very high impacting services, but maybe only supported a business unit as opposed to pan defense. And service tier three, minimum level of integration, not necessarily something that needed to align as closely as those service tier ones and tier twos, but still needed that minimum level of integration. And then in the previous world, the registered services were all those services that I talked about that didn't typically integrate, but in this new model, they would have even a minimum level of integration. And so that description on the left is from the new service management framework, which describes those levels of integration. And as I mentioned, we talked about supplier tiers in the previous iteration. This was tweaked to be service tiers because it's quite possible that suppliers may supply more than one service to defence, and it's based on a service tiering as opposed to the supplier, because one supplier may supply multiple services that are graded or sort of assessed, triaged as being different levels of, or requiring different levels of integration. So it's a slight tweak in language to show that it's a service by service level of integration rather than by supplier. And then on the right, this was part of our description of those different service tiers. So what the process would be, as you can see, there's a registration activity, there's a triage assessment, which I'll mention a little bit about in just a moment, and then the description of those different services. So registered services, what they are on the hook for and what they can utilize or benefit from our service integration activity, and then service tier 3, 2 and 1. And the color schemes obviously there are deliberate. You've kind of almost got like a bronze, silver, gold activity. So in order for that to work, in order for us to be able to understand what service tier happened at each level, when they were sort of starting up, we needed some kind of tool to be able to triage and give the relevant information at the right time. So we set about designing a number of tools to support this activity. And this is part of the innovation. This is part of that, do something different, do something more consumable. And so we developed a number of tools utilizing things that we already had to hand. So these tools that I'm demonstrating now, or I'm going to show you, I can't demonstrate them unfortunately because I'm not on my work laptop due to the Zoom chat. So I've got some screenshots for you, but I can talk you through how they work. And essentially they were developed and designed within sort of Power Apps suite that we had, and fully customizable and sustainable. So the first one I'm going to show you is the SMF triage assessment tool. And so does is enable a service to put some key information about the service at that early stage. So at the very early stage when they're going through, potentially even before procurement, some details about the intended size and scale of the service. Um, it also talks about the categorization, so whether it's produced within Defence Digital, because that sort of had an impact as to whether it was something that we would consider for full integration, or whether it would be something that would be on a case by case basis. Whether it was deployed, as I mentioned, it's quite difficult at the moment for us to fully integrate deployed services, but that's something that we're addressing. And whether it's an above secret system, which is treated slightly different than some of our official and secret systems and services. So there was a number of kind of brief questions that sort of helped us to categorize this. And this particular triage assessment tool was powered by a logic that then, following on from those initial questions and then some other drill down questions, would then assess the scale of the service and the controls that they would need to follow based on the recommendation for the service tier. So again, some further questions about what the operational impact would be if there was a major incident, how many MoD users if there was a service outage, the scope of the service, so whether it's pan defense or a single business unit or perhaps even smaller than that, what likely service incident death ticket volumes, for example. Some of these things are estimates, and we recognize that. So whilst this tool provides a triage, there's a sort of a kind of a caveat that obviously this does need to be have a further conversation with our front door so that we can understand the size and scale when there's further information. Classification of the information, so if the information was lost, what risk would that create? And the categorization of the supplier, whether it's sort of a big multinational or a slightly smaller supplier, for example. And then based on the various scores and the logic that's answered there, it gives a recommendation to that service at that very early stage. So on the basis of this particular example that I was doing, it recommended it was service tier 1. So it gave the user instructions to email our front door so that they could put that in through there. I mean, the back end of this all goes to the front door anyway, but if they had specific requests, they could email at that point. It also gives the controls that then for the tier 1 in the service management framework. And so whilst we have a document that covers all the tiers and it's like the Bible that shows everything that all services need to do, in order to make it more consumable, we wanted to only give the information that was needed so that people weren't confused by any other information that perhaps wasn't relevant to them. So it very clearly says follow the controls for all services and the additional controls for tier 1 in the service management framework. And then they click on that button and then it gives them the relevant information. So it controls the flow of information, it controls what they see, and it also provides all those touch points with all the other areas of information that might help them. What this did was try to put a simple interface on a complex problem. It tried to make it really easy for the user to use, but also behind that simple interface, there's a slightly more complex and nuanced response. So we're getting the information really early to see what's coming down the pipeline. And so if there are sort of responses within that framework that provides a sort of a need for a conversation with that system or service so that we can do that proprietary work before they're coming down the pipeline to do that level of integration, then that can be had. And so that's what we were trying to achieve. The other thing this does is it also helps that dynamic approach to integration, because this is powered by a logic or an algorithm. So for example, if suddenly we're able to integrate a greater number of services, for example, because there's, for example, the strategic defence review, it means we've got to do something differently or we have to do work in a different way, rather than actually have to change the policy or change the controls, we change the flow of services that are being sent down the pipeline for integration. So if, for example, we're suddenly now needing to integrate our deployed services to a greater level, rather than change the policy, we tweak this so that those services are now directed to that particular level of integration. Or switch it off. So there's a nut that we can be much more dynamic, and rather than actually change the policy, we change the flow of who is needing to integrate at that level. Additionally, this was supported by some more consumable ways of actually interacting with the policy and the standards and controls. And so, as I mentioned, the document exists in all levels, all tiers, regardless of what service you are. There is one version of the service management framework, but there's also different cuts. And what we produced was a tool that could support somebody depending on their level of experience at navigating the journey through this particular SIAM ecosystem. So if you are very inexperienced, you've never perhaps done this through the mod before, this might be your first time, we've tried to help and provide self-help to navigate through that journey. And whether you want it online or offline, this particular version is an online tool, again, use Power Apps, but we also created it as a PowerPoint so that if people needed to work offline or print things out because they didn't like it, there was the same experience but offline. Um, and they could use these particular buttons. So they could click on the buttons at the different stages. So, for example, service design. I've just clicked to show you that you click on the service design if you want to find out what controls at that stage. All those numbers there refer to the document controls that you would be having to consider at that particular stage in the process. So you can use that interactively, or you could jump to the specific control that you wanted to have a look at. So this particular control that I've shown is 29. It's about the operational life support wrapper. It's got all the links to where you need to go to. It's got all the relevant forms. It gives you the people that you need to speak to. It tells you even at the bottom the assurance route that you need to take for this, whether it's something you need to consider through life. It also, if you hover over where it says why is this in the actual tool, it gives you the rationale for why you're having to do this particular piece of work. And for more information, you click, so you can still see the original control if there's information there you want to refer back to, but then there's also a whole list of information about the sort of, in this particular case, what should be in the STB, and that you can click through and find the information that you need at the point that you need it. So it's designed to try to take pressure off already busy teams, but also to provide that self-help for people navigating through that process. So I'm kind of coming to the end of my presentation now. I think the key messages that I wanted to get across was the fact that we were trying to do something simple, a simple interface on a complex issue. We were trying to communicate clear, concise messages in an innovative way, but still allowing for nuance and variation. So how we could control that level of integration, and how we control the flow of services coming down that pipeline without having to constantly change policy. Um, the result is obviously designing and delivering services that are more operable and supportable. And I think that was the sort of the thing that we were trying to achieve through all of this. So I'll stop there. I think hopefully I haven't gone over my half an hour, and I'll take any questions if anyone has anything.